But I do want to end. I just want to say that this lecture will eventually come to an end. I just want to end with a story which is so curious and so strange, and once again tells you something about Rav Kook, this old world rabbi, this traditional orthodox rabbi, a scholar, pious, devout. Use every adjective you can find to define someone like him. And yet he was way out of the box. I mean, completely out of the box in ways that you just would never think. And this is just a story. It's a very strange story about Rav Kook out of the box. In 1912, a scurrilous pamphlet appeared in Jaffa. I've never actually seen one. I found this image online. It was titled, this is in Yiddish, "The Bandit of Jerusalem." It was authored and published by someone called Meah Shearim. And it accused a man called YAAKOV Moshe HERLING of abusing and raping his sister and more. HERLING was a highly respected member of the Yishuv HaYashan, of this very devout Orthodox community in Jerusalem that was principally supported by donations from abroad. He was on the board, in fact, on the managing board of the Warsaw Kollel, which managed all the funds that were collected in Warsaw and in that region of Poland, and came to Eretz Yisrael, and then they would distribute it to those whose families had come from that region of Poland. He was on the board for the distribution of that money. He was also on the board of an orphanage in Jerusalem. And Kaiser, the man who wrote the pamphlet and who accused HERLING of raping his sister, was the son of a very mysterious miracle worker rabbi called Rabbi Alter Noach Hacohen Michalensky Kaiser. A lot of names, but people in those days did have various names, usually to avoid military conscription. He was also known as the Yarden of a Rebbe. The Rebbe was from Poland. He had a very checkered past. Wherever he went, he got into fights with rabbis and with Jewish leaders. And he was born in 1852 in a place called Neshchiz. He studied Kabbalah in Palestine in the 1870s. He came and studied with the Sephardic Kabbalists. He went back to a place called Remet, which is near Sigit, Romania, Hungary, depending which year. And he began to act as a rebbe. He declared that he is a hasidic rebbe. And the common folk loved him because he did miracle stuff. You'd come to him, you were sick, he'd give you a little piece of paper with Hebrew writing on it, or he'd say he'd pray for you and you're going to get better. If you drink water before 7 and wine after 6, then everything's going to be okay. And he was loved by the common folk, but the rabbis despised him, particularly one of the senior rabbis at that time, a man called Maharam Shik. And he was hounded out of Remet. He went to a place called Droibich, which is in Poland. At that time, today it's in the Ukraine. In 1890, he arrived in Yardenov, which is Galicia. It's part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And he began calling himself the Yardenov Rebbe and calling people in and doing miracle stuff. And the local Hasidim had heard bad stuff about him from elsewhere. And they decided to report him to the authorities. And he was arrested for spying. And you might think that's a joke, because how could someone who looked like that be a spy for the Russians? You've heard stranger stuff, maybe even from me. But there you go. He was not only accused of spying, he was sentenced to 5 years in prison for spying. And somehow he appealed. He only was in prison for 1.5 years. But when they heard he was being released, the Hasidim in Yardenov burnt his house down. They obviously didn't like him. And they were harassing him so much that he wandered from place to place. In 1896, he arrived in London. I've seen the reports, the newspaper reports, when this man came to London. He was the first Hasidic Rebbe to visit London. And he lived in the East End of London. And he used to go backwards and forwards to Palestine. Now, you have to know traveling wasn't easy in those days. Probably took him a month to get there and a month to get back. And Wherever he went, he was fundraising for the next visit and the next trip and the next group of people. And wherever he went, he had friends and people who liked him, and he was very charismatic and a good speaker, and he'd published a couple of Sforim. And in 1910, he came to Palestine with a daughter and a son and an aged mother, and they stayed in the Warshawski Hotel. The Warshawski Hotel was owned by this fellow, YAAKOV Moshe HERLING. And at some point, after a few weeks, he says to Mr. HERLING, he says, I have to tell you, I've got to go back to England. Can I leave my son and daughter here and you'll take care of them? And my mother, and I'll come back for them. And here's money, 3 months worth of money for you to, how much do you want? He told him how much he wanted. He gave him the money and off he goes to England. And 3 months passes and no Yarden of a rebbe. And another 3 months and another 3 months, and these two kids are staying in the hotel, and he's sending letters to London, and no one's coming. And eventually, the Yarden of a Rebbe comes back, and he goes to Jaffa because he knows Rav Kook. They'd exchanged correspondence with each other, and Rav Kook quite likes him. And HERLING hears that he's in Jaffa, and he goes to Jaffa, and he says to him, can I have my money? He said, I don't owe you any money. He says, you do. Your kids, stay with me. He said, what are you talking? You were terrible to my children. You made them work. You put them in the cellar. And you made my mother starve. I don't owe you any money. In fact, you owe me money. And he said, what are you talking about? And then he said, you know something else? That my daughter told my mother that you raped her. And then this pamphlet comes out. And HERLING is a fine, upstanding man. He's got a reputation. And he's extremely angry. And he comes to Jaffa and he goes to Rav Kook and he says, I'd like to sue this man for libel. Whatever the halachic version of libel. And Rav Kook agrees. But he decides that this is not a case to be judged by a bet din. There's a concept in halakha that in monetary matters, you go to a beit din. But when it's about a knas, a fine, you have shiva tuvei ha'ir. You go to 7 city elders. And he decides that this is a case where we should engage with the city elders and that they should take part in a tribunal that's going to decide whether or not there is a case for libel here and whether the Yarden of a Rebbe or the son who authored this pamphlet owes him money. And if that's not shocking enough to you, the most shocking aspect of this is that he shows himself as one of the Shiva Tuvei Ha'ir, but the other 6 were all secular Jews. I've just taken 4 examples. The first one is YAAKOV SHERTOK, who lived in Jaffa at the time. He's a secular Russian Zionist pioneer who came in 1908 to Palestine. And he's one of the founders of Tel Aviv, and he was also one of the founders of the gymnasium school, which Rav Kook was so against. But more importantly, his son was later the Prime Minister of Israel, MOSHE SHARETT. MOSHE SHARETT became a SHERTOK. SHARETT became a prominent labor Zionist, and he was a friend of David Ben-Gurion, and was later the Prime Minister and Minister of Government. Another one was Mordechai ben Hillel Hacohen, a Zionist thinker, writer, one of the founders of Tel Aviv. ELIYAHU Berlin, who's a very, very secular, ultra-secular, libertarian, liberal Zionist politician, founder of Tel Aviv, also involved with the gymnasium school. And most spectacular, most peculiar of all was the last one I've chosen. There were another 2. Sarah THON. Sarah, do you know anything about him? About her? An incredible woman, Sylvia Pankhurst of Palestine. Okay, she was an outspoken women's rights campaigner, a social worker and an educator. You couldn't get more secular than her. These were the Tuvei Ha'ir chosen by Rav Kook for this tribunal. And the first hearing took place on Saturday night, February 24th, 1912. It was reported in all the newspapers. This became the story of the year. Every day, all the newspapers in Palestine, the Hebrew newspapers, were full of this story about the hasidic rebbe's daughter who was raped in a hotel in Meah Shearim. I mean, it doesn't get better than that, right? The whole trial was covered, and in all there were 12 sessions until the beginning of April that year in Jaffa, and there were also 3 hearings in Jerusalem where they interviewed various people who had a certain knowledge about Warshawski's hotel and about HERLING and about the Yarden of a rebbe. And they were all interviewed and cross-examined in the court, the rebbe. I mean, I've got the protocols, the daily... it's been put together actually recently by a man called Dr. Nathan Brun, who's a very eminent jurist in Israel. He's taught law in Hebrew University in Bar Ilan. He's about in his 80s, and he put together the timeline of this trial with all the different interviews. He took it out of all the newspapers and reports, and he's put it together. It's a very brilliantly put together thing. And before I tell you what the verdict was, the ruling of this strange episode, this strange tribunal, let me point out that it was extremely unorthodox for another reason. Rav Kook should have recused himself. How could he hear a case if he had a personal connection, a friendship with one of the litigants? The Yarden of a rebbe was somebody he knew well. And the verdict, bearing that in mind, when it came, was quite shocking, very unusual, because the judges reached the following decision. There was no monetary fine, but HERLING was guilty as charged. They couldn't prove, based on the testimony that they had heard, at least according to what they wrote in the ruling, they couldn't prove that he had raped this girl, but they were certain the girl had been raped. They were certain that things were going on in that hotel which were totally unsavory. They were certain that he was financially misbehaving, and they were also absolutely sure that the Yarden of a rebbe did not owe him the amount of money that he was claiming. So it was a complete reversal of fortune. But what is so strange about this story is not the verdict. That's strange in and of itself in this forgotten episode. What's extremely strange is that the verdict was signed by only 6 of the judges, not Rav Kook. And Rav Kook, they said, would issue his own decision or opinion, at a minority opinion at a later date. He never did. And it would appear from all the anecdotal evidence that has been gathered since then that Rav Kook felt that HERLING was innocent. So although he had started off the trial as a friend of the Yarden of a rebbe, this Ish Emes, this man of truth, was so swayed by what he heard that he couldn't align himself with the verdict of the judges, who he perhaps felt were biased against that religious Jew from the extremist community in Jerusalem, and who probably was, in some respects, taking advantage of these kids because he felt he hadn't been paid and asking them to do a bit of work in the kitchen. And therefore he refused to sign on this ruling. I have to tell you one last piece. I think we've got the image here, that HERLING was so taken by the verdict that he thanked the judges, even though they found him guilty, because he wasn't financially liable. And he published this thank you in the newspapers. Everyone in all communities erupted in uproar, and this was, of course, in 1912, a very, very important story, but by 1913, everyone had forgotten. But it's worth remembering for this reason, because Rav Kook, in 1912, was willing to go out on a limb to do something so out of the box to make sure that the secular Jews in his community felt included. And he felt that halachically he could create this Shiva Tuvei Ha'ir, these 7 city elders, even from a group of Jews who were irreligious. He felt that that was halachically fine. I mean, he got burnt and he never did it again. But it tells you something about the incredible bravery of Rav Kook, his originality in his thinking and in his way of operating, as an example of a very unique style. And he continues to act as an influence to this day. and in the land of Israel, the state of Israel, and among Jews across the world, Rav Kook is a man who is an inspiration to Jewish life and to every Jew. Thank you.